We are going to be looking at chapters 2, 3, and 4 in Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on the care of our common home. What we're going to do is have some opening remarks from each of our panelists, and then a few more questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. It should wrap up in about an hour. So to begin with, I'd like to introduce our panelists. One we're waiting for, and we hope that she'll pop in soon. And there she is. Terrific. Welcome.
All right.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm not going anywhere.
Not at all. So why don't I introduce our recent guest. First of all, Mary Evelyn Tucker is co-director of the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale, where she teaches in a Master's of Arts program between the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Divinity School. With John Grimm, she organized 10 conferences on world religions and ecology at Harvard University, has authored and co-edited numerous books, co-wrote Journey of the Universe, which was published by Yale University Press in 2011, and was the executive director of the Emmy Award-winning Journey film that aired on PBS. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
And let me just...
And I'm only going to be able to stay for 15 minutes because I'm at this conference in Detroit. I'm sorry about that. Also on the encyclical with my husband, John.
Oh, okay, no problem.
I sent a message, but sorry.
Not at all. So maybe we'll get to you first with a question. And then I'm having a little trouble with my screen, so let me try to fix this. And then Father Sean McDonagh is an Irish Columban priest known around the world as an eco-theologian who works to raise awareness on the connections between justice and peace issues, environmental sustainability, and faith. It was during his work with the indigenous Tuboli people on the Philippine island of Mindanao in the 1970s and 1980s that his understanding of environmental issues and the relationship between faith, justice, and ecology took hold. Father Sean strongly urges the Church to undergo an ecological conversion, advocating that environmental justice must be a core Catholic activity. So, Father Sean, welcome. Hope we're still there. Father Michael Perry was born in Indianapolis. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in History and Philosophy and a Master's of Arts in Theology, and then a Master's of Divinity. He was ordained in June of 1984. Father Perry was assigned to serve his province, his Franciscan province, in the formation of its candidates and while working on his doctorate in religious anthropology. He was elected Minister General of the Franciscan Order, that's the head of the Franciscans, on May 22nd, 2013. So welcome, Father Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Professor Vincent Miller holds the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Theology and Culture at the University, where he works in the Department of Religious Studies and with the Hanley Sustainability Institute. He received his doctorate in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of Consuming Religion, Christian Faith and Practice in a Consumer Culture, and he's also a blogger for America Media. He's currently editing a book on Laudato Si entitled Everything is Connected, and is writing a book on the impact of globalization and technology upon moral responsibility, solidarity, community, and the Church. So welcome, Vince.
Thank you, Father Jim. It's good to be here.
Great. So I'll turn to Mary first. What I'd like to do is just ask you to maybe briefly give you a give a quick intro. Anything you'd like to say about Laudato Si, and if we have time, I can ask you one of the questions.
Thank you, colleagues, and Sean, friend for a long time, and Father Martin, thanks for moderating. I just wanted to share that, on this almost anniversary of the encyclical, I think we're feeling John Grimm, my husband, and I, and many others here in the States, a tremendous feeling of gratitude, of course, for the Pope. His popularity continues to amaze and inspire many people. But I wanted to just share that, in particular, the scientists at our School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale have a very strong respect for this encyclical. Our dean, Peter Crane, who was head of the Kew Botanical Gardens in England and also the Field Museum in Chicago, had us do a panel on the encyclical even before it came out. Now, he's a major now a moral issue. And excuse me. Sorry, did I lose you?
We lost you about 1 minute. The last thing you said was it was a moral issue.
Okay, that the scientists are agreeing with us that it's a moral issue. And that's a huge step because we've been working on this with many of you and for decades. And the scientists thought that this could be solved by science alone or by policy alone or economics or technology or media and law. But now it's very, very clear, and even at this School of the Environment, which is the oldest school in the US for the environment, is agreeing that this is a moral issue and the encyclical matters. I'll just give one other quick example of that. A policy person, Dan Esty, who also teaches at the law school, last summer when it came out, I said, well, what did you think? And he said, well, the Pope doesn't agree with cap and trade. And I said, you know, let's look at the whole encyclical. He came back from the COP conference in Paris, and in January we had another panel at Yale, and he started the panel by saying the COP conference on climate change, where 195 countries agreed to reduce their emissions for the first time. He held up the encyclical and he said, this is what made the difference. This is what brought the countries together. Again, this is amazing to those of us who are working in secular academia for many years. It's a great breakthrough. And I think the final thing, two other points, is our students are energized by this. They see that it can have huge effect, over 1 billion Catholics, 2 billion Christians altogether. But they're excited because they see leadership that's bringing together ecology and justice. And they are passionate about justice. And as we know, those two areas have not always been brought together as effectively, certainly, as this encyclical. So they're excited because of this integral ecology. And maybe a final point, I'm sorry, Monsignor couldn't join us today because we were together in Iran in April at a conference that the Iranian government held along with UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, and UNESCO. And there I spoke also about the encyclical. And this is clearly an Islamic country. They've done several conferences on this already, namely religion, ecology, and the environment. And they too, other religious traditions are responding clearly. But I just wanted to share our excitement about this and the continual effort of so many people, including all of you on the panel and Father Martin, to bring this forward, and we hope we can help in whatever ways possible. So thank you.
Well, Dr. Tucker, given that you have to leave soon, maybe I can ask you a quick question. What was it?
Father Martin?
Yes. This is it's a spiritual and it's a religious document, and one might think that might not be as accepted by the secular world. What do you think it was that enabled people to accept, an essentially religious document as a contribution to the conversation?
Yeah, sorry, it went off again. So I missed what you were saying, Father Martin.
So this is essentially a religious document, a religious and spiritual document. What do you think enabled the larger secular community to accept it as readily as it has, given that it's that's coming from the Vatican, and that some people might be turned off by that? What was it that people that you think sort of what resonated with them, and what enabled it to be heard in the secular community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would say, first of all, the Pope, of course, himself is popular, and he embodies these values in all kinds of ways: simplicity of living, authentic outreach to people of difference, of color, of race, of gender, and things like that. So I think the Pope is a great ambassador for all of this. But I think the timing is so crucial, and because after the Copenhagen conference, and Sean knows this history very well, but when the science was not communicating the urgency of climate change, but a range of issues of toxicities and biodiversity loss, the scientists themselves lost faith in their own science and the models and that particular way of communicating. And that led to an openness to realize there's other ways to communicate the urgency of our present moment. And they also realized the religious communities, with their large numbers of people, institutional authority, moral force, and potential, are key partners in this. And so that, I think, the opening of science not communicating well gave the possibility of this moral force, and an encyclical which brought together these key issues, of the planet is in serious trouble. Our economic systems are not helping. In fact, this belief in growth and in progress is an impediment to the flourishing of the Earth community. And finally, that the poor are clearly suffering. So the scientists get this, but they weren't able to pull the thread through all of these different issues. And the economists were only taking one part of it. So this threads through ecology, economics, and equity in remarkable ways. And it's also pastoral. People see it as gentle but forceful, invitational but prophetic. And that tone, I think, has helped enormously, because it's saying everyone has a role here. The Pope is not trying to be giving people guilt or saying, you're to blame in the first world, and so on and so forth. He's like, everyone needs to be at the table contributing to the future of the planet. And that invitational non-guilt trip is very, very important, especially with hope and the sense of the mystery of the universe, this Teilhardian sense that's in it. Thomas Berry clearly has had influence over many, many years. And again, Sean McDonagh has had that wonderful influence that we share from Thomas Berry. So there's hope and there's possibility that we're part of an unfolding universe, and we have a role here to contribute to its continuity. That hope is absolutely critical, and I think it can only be given fully in its full form by the religious communities. And people see that in the encyclical.
Thank you. It's very helpful and articulate. Father Sean, since you were mentioned, would you like to offer your perspective, as an introductory remark on Laudato Si?
Compare the Compendium of Social Teachings of the Church was published in 2004, and it's a long document, over 300 pages. There was just 15 pages on the environment. There was 1/2 paragraph on climate change and 1/2 paragraph on biodiversity. There was 9 paragraphs, by the way, on biotechnology. So in Catholic terms, like Mary Evelyn talked about, for example, the conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change. I've been going to those since Nairobi back in 2006. Until 1996, the Catholic Church was very seldom present there. Even at the Copenhagen conference, the voice of the Catholic Church wasn't heard. So this is an extraordinary document. It's an extraordinary new document. Encyclicals are written normally for cardinals and patriarchs. They don't bring in the wisdom of the church. I think there's 21 references to bishops' conferences. how they see this justice and ecology reality across their world. And pride of place he gives to the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, who he says there in the first chapter that these things, destroying the environment, destroying biodiversity, these are sins. Now, this is an extraordinary statement from a pope. So right through this, he's saying there are three fundamental connections in our living in this world: our relationship with God, our relationship with our neighbor, and also our relationship with the natural world itself. And in the chapters that we're looking at, for example, here, he takes very clearly, he takes from John Paul II, he takes Christians realize their commitment to nature and the environment are an essential part of their faith. Now, the reality is that's not true. It's what we would hope to become true. But he has brought about, right in that particular chapter, he has talked about people who understood that all of creation there was for humankind. He said, that's not a proper interpretation. The church does not support that interpretation of the Bible. So in a sense, he reshapes theology in this particular chapter. And the one thing I love about the encyclical, you asked, Marielle, why are the scientific world accepting it? Because in actual fact, it's the first document from the Catholic Church at that level that actually deals with the science. It deals very beautifully, for example, with climate change. He talks about the consensus. He talks about why it's happening, and humans are responsible. And he talks about the fact that the poor will suffer most, even though they have done less to call it. But the other dimension is there's actually more on biodiversity than there is actually on climate change. And he's saying to us in these chapters, for example, other species have intrinsic value. So that's a whole new area of spirituality. If other creatures have intrinsic value, they are looking from us for a claim. And Mary Ellen mentioned, for example, the Kew Gardens. 3 weeks ago, Kew Gardens brought out an extraordinary document on the plant life of the world, telling us there's probably 350,000 plants in our world. But they're saying also that 20% of our plant life is heading towards extinction. That's the awfulness of where we are at the moment. So he has given real force to this new understanding, but I think we have to be honest and say, we haven't understood this before. I was ordained in the 1960s during Advent, and the post-communion prayer was, Lord, teach us to despise the things of earth and to love the things of heaven. Amare Celeste. That's the world we have come out of. And I think this is an extraordinary new possibility. And as Mary said, he's inviting everyone. It's not just for Catholics. There are no Catholic lakes or Buddhist forests. He's saying this is the plight of the people of the earth, and it's the plight of planet Earth. Now everyone has a role to play. And I'm giving my vision as a Christian. He said that he quotes, for example, from a Sufi mystic in the Middle Ages. So he's including everyone and saying we're all in this together. And of course, anyone who's ever been involved in interreligious dialogue knows when you begin to work together with other people on topics like this, on challenges like this, then you come together and you begin to understand better the religious realities, even the things that keep us apart. So I think it's wonderful. He has a completely new anthropology.
I'll hold it for you.
The reality is we're connected to everything on the planet. We're no longer cut off from it as we were so often in the past. And the one lovely thing he does is when he talks about ecology, as Mary Ellen says, he talks about integral ecology. That's a huge change from the way Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict talked about ecology. They normally spoke about human ecology. And people like myself pointed out, how can ecology is the study of the relationship between the biosphere, the sphere of life, and the other spheres, the cryosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere. And in the reality of the biosphere, you have 5 kingdoms, and one of the kingdoms is the kingdom of animals, animalia, mammals, ourselves, and primates. So he has been very sensitive to that, and I think that's one of the reasons why the scientific community are taking this, because previous to this, we often got the science, even in one of Pope John Paul's documents, we got the science between the depletion of the ozone layer and climate change. Not actually totally correct. So this is a fabulous document, but it will need time to be buried into the consciousness. And that's why I say I think it should be a 3-year program of synod. First of all, helping people to encounter the natural world in their own area, then looking at the problems that he has outlined here, biodiversity, the area of climate change. Then, obviously, at the national level, the oceans are something that's been destroyed hugely, and then at the international level on the third year. I think that would be a great service on the part of the church to bring this extraordinary, insightful, prophetic document into the world, and for people who maybe are not going to church, synagogue, mosque. They have so much to offer also in making this possible.
Thank you, Father Sean. Very articulate and very helpful. I like how you talk about the sort of newness of focusing on all of ecology, not human ecology. Father Michael, can you talk a little bit about your initial reactions to the document and maybe a little introductory remark?
I think at first, for me personally, I was excited. I was excited because of my experience of living in Africa, seeing the degradation of the environment, and not just the degradation of the environment, the impact, the human impact that it had and continues to have on people's lives, the quality of people's lives, their health, their ability to perform, to be able to produce food, to be able to survive. The necessity of so many people having to move from one place to another now in search of possibilities of survival. 61 million migrants wandering about the world looking for some place they can call home where they can have the necessary elements to survive. I think I really found the document exciting. I found it helpful. I found it challenging. I find it something which I've read 4 times, and I keep going. I'm going to go back to it 5 or 6 more times at least. I say that because I think it's a document that needs, as I think Father Sean said, needs lots of time to be absorbed. There's the whole technical side, the scientific side, which I think also, I'm not a scientist, but I think it was very carefully done. The caution might be the best word, but in a way that was, I think, helpful both to the scientific community, but also to those who are not scientists. It helped us understand what's at play and the urgency to which we need to respond. I think a second element that was already mentioned by the 2 previous speakers was the element of this connectedness, interconnectedness. It's so funny when we talk about computers, we talk about being connected in one way or another. I'm not sure that necessarily creates stronger bonds of relationship, though. I think what the Pope is calling for is that for us to understand what's going on inside of the world, the natural world and its impact on the human world, its impact on the natural world, we have to enter into direct relationship with these realities. We have to come face to face in some manner or another. 2 things that come to mind. I recall working once a number of years ago on the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And until Senator Jesse Helms came face to face with the human child that he held in his arms who was HIV infected, it made no sense to him at all what was going on. And only at that point was he able to recognize and enter into a dialogue with the people who are living with and confronting the issue of this health pandemic. I use that as an example because I think we, in many ways, the Pope is telling us we need to get back to be in contact with nature. We can't simply pull out from nature that which we want, that which satisfies our needs. We need to enter into a permanent relationship with nature, which is completely transformed. A new way of understanding and respecting, a new way of collaborating, this cooperation model that I found, the relational cooperation model that I found present throughout the document. And the leitmotif of all is connected, the sense that we depend one upon the other, that nature is inside of us, we are inside of nature. And somehow we've got to find a way to be able to demonstrate that and make that come alive for us, and let that begin to reshape the way that we live our lives. The simplicity that the Pope speaks of in the document, simplifying our lives, in a sense, freeing ourselves from being slaves to consumerism and to individualism, and recognizing the component of the element of the poor, and again, this high relationship that brings about a new moral responsibility. So that in effect, I think the document's calling for a new moral paradigm for all of us. So I think those are a few comments I would make. I'm very pleased also that the Pope used Laudato Si, the Canticle of the Preachers of St. Francis of Assisi, which in and of itself, for me as a Franciscan, for us Franciscans, speaks of this integrity of relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a good point, and I think the significance of someone named Francis promulgating this was not lost on people. I think in the beginning, people might have thought, he was taking Francis in terms of poverty, and simplicity, which was certainly the case. But it's obviously, I think the name has a much deeper resonance for the Pope and for the world. Dr. Miller, introductory remarks on the encyclical.
Yes, thank you. So we're looking at the second, third, and fourth chapter, and the second chapter, Integral Ecology, is one of the central pieces of the encyclical. As Father Perry said, it has the leitmotif of the encyclical. Everything is connected. So I'd like to devote my opening comments just to that. In terms of the cause of our environmental and social problems, in Francis's understanding, the problem is that we focus on ourselves, and humankind ignores its interconnections with the rest of the world. We destroy God's creation, and since we're part of that whole, we destroy ourselves in the process. I want to highlight 3 dimensions of this phrase, integral ecology, in the encyclical. I think it's a set of beliefs about creation. It's most importantly a way of seeing that seeks to attend to the interconnections. And it's a moral principle that guides actions to cherish, preserve, and restore those connections. As a set of beliefs, integral ecology is based upon doctrines and scriptural themes that teach the interconnections among all creation. In Francis' words, they teach us that each creature is a caress of God. Francis notes that the laws found in the Bible dwell on relationships, not only among individuals, but with other living beings, such as the Sabbath requirement to give the day off to both donkeys and oxen as well. The ultimate foundation for this is religious, theological. It's the doctrine of creation and the triune relational God as the creator of all things, and that all created things thus are members of one family in God. In Francis' words, each creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous. The entire material universe speaks of God's love, God's boundless affection for us all. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. So these beliefs provide the basis for a way of seeing the world, what Francis calls a gaze of serene attentiveness. Francis speaks of it as an attitude of heart, which approaches life with serene attentiveness, which is capable of being fully present. And Jesus is the example of that loving gaze. Integral ecology, as a way of seeing, is the patient openness to imagine and to understand the many interconnections among the other creatures with whom we share the world. Everything around us, soil, trees, birds, animals, are so much more than the simple objects that meet our eyes. They're interconnected in ways that have profound importance for our lives, in fact, which our lives depend upon. Consider the example of soil. We know that it's more than dirt, of course. It's where plants grow, but it's teeming with microscopic life, bacteria, fungi, microscopic animals, all essential. In ecologist Aldo Leopold's analysis, the soil itself is a community. It's the foundation of a fountain of energy that flows from the sun through plants and animals, all of which give us life. Without soil, there are no humans. And to return to the theology here, in the Hebrew name of the first person in the Bible, Adama, literally means being of the soil. The science and the spirituality connect here. Integral ecology inspires us to gaze with patient openness to learn those connections. Finally, integral ecology is a moral principle, a way of acting to honor, preserve, and restore our connections with the rest of creation. And I think this is one of the key contributions of the encyclical. There is a long-standing Catholic social imagination and a Catholic moral framework. Catholicism has long cultivated the vision that sees social connections and the social dimensions of morality, what St. Pope John Paul II called the virtue of solidarity. And I think it's really helpful to think of integral ecology as the expansion of solidarity from social interdependence with other human beings to human interdependence with the rest of creation. Just as an infant grows into an adult and learns to contribute back to the society in which he or she was born, nurtured, and matured, so humankind must now develop a vision that allows us to perceive, appreciate, and cultivate our interconnection with the rest of creation. So this unity of science and theology is very profound in the notion of integral ecology. And as a theologian, I want to conclude by emphasizing how deeply religious and how theological Francis' vision is. It's derived from Christian faith in the Trinity, And one of the richest theological passages in the entire encyclical comes in paragraph number 240. He says, the divine persons are subsistent relations, and the world created according to the divine model is a web of relationships. This leads us not only to marvel at the manifold connections among creatures, but also to discover the key to our own fulfillment. The human person grows more, matures more, and is sanctified more to the extent that he or she enters into relationships, going out from themselves to live in communion with God, with others, and with all creatures. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I'd like to now start to ask questions to each of the panelists. And Professor Miller, you know, because you brought it up, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the Trinity. You mentioned that. How does our Christian understanding of God and relationship, you know, the Trinity as a community of persons, influence the encyclical, and how can it influence our understanding of the environment? I mean, I'll leave that somewhat open-ended for you because the Trinity is, you know, kind of a mystery. But how does the Trinity and maybe the Trinity as community help the encyclical, and how does it help us? How can it help us understand our relationship with the environment?
Yeah, so belief in God as Trinity, that God is already before creation, a community of persons. Love is relationship. Gives us this basic idea underneath it all that the essence of reality is relationship, right? If God created the world and the world reflects God's being, then relationship will be manifest in the world. And this is what science shows us, right? We are not individual species that each pursue our own individual goals independent from one another, but we're intimately related. We're dependent upon other. We're all these cycles and circles and relationships that we can only begin to understand. So I think there's a real partnership between the spirituality and the theology of Trinitarian being and openness to the science of ecology, the science of planetary connections, which find these interrelationships in the world around us. And to honor that science is in some ways a manifestation of honoring our Trinitarian faith.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Father Perry, St. Francis is obviously a very central figure in Laudato Si. It's a very big question, but you know, I can think of no one better than the Minister General of the Franciscans to answer it. How does Francis's approach and his relationship with the environment influence the encyclical, would you say? Not sure if we lost Father Perry, so let me turn to Father Sean.
Sure.
You know, Father Sean, something I mentioned to Mary Evelyn about the secular community. How would you say that, sort of a sort of expansion of that, how would you say the use of Scripture, which is, you know, very heavy in these sections, help the world community and then also the religious community understand our relationship with the environment? How does Scripture figure into this encyclical, and how does it help us?
Well, it helps us, as you say, Pope Francis takes Francis very centrally, but he also takes Ignatius very centrally. And basically, it's a discernment document. And in his discernment document, he's talking about the reality of the natural world around us, what's happening to it. He's talking about biodiversity, all the wonderful creatures that we now know, the small ones, the big ones, the use of microscopes and all of that. So onto that, then he says at the beginning of chapter 2, I'd like to share, people might say, well, the Christians have nothing to share. I'd like to share with you the Christian vision of this, and not excluding any other vision, but it brings something, some richness. And of course it does. It begins us to make the connectedness with the natural world. It begins also to correct some of the ways we as Christians acted in the past. We acted by saying, well, all of creation is out there for us. The doctrine of the signature in the Middle Ages was exactly that. God created the world. Everything out there was meant for humankind. The big challenge to humankind was to find out what God meant this thing for us. So he's using the science. He's also using his religious our Christian religious tradition. He's challenging misuses of that in the past. saying everything out there is for us. It's not. He's now talking about, particularly in the area of biodiversity, that now we need to come to this encounter with creation and to be aware, like one of the things I've been talking about here recently, we're about to lose here in Ireland one of the most extraordinary birds, the curlew, that's deep within our tradition, that's deep within our history. But we're not even having a funeral. That's what religion does. Religion captures these kind of moments. So Francis does that hugely in this document. And I can see religious people, for example, I'm preparing a book at the moment, and I've talked to a person who's an atheist but works in one of the environmental organizations. He's hugely appreciative of the fact that Francis has presented the Christian message in a public way. He was being led to believe that Christianity was our private religion and we get to our private. This is a public statement. He's not forcing it down anyone's throat, but he is saying this has a lot to offer to this extraordinary issue of trying to look after the poor of the world and also live in a sustainable way into the future and live in joy. And I think that's what he has done, and done it very well.
Now, Father Sean, since you've a follow-up question for you, and I think just for those who are joining us in the middle of the program, Dr. Tucker, Professor Tucker had to leave, and I think we've lost Father Perry from Medellin. Father Sean, you've worked a lot with this issue, over the years, and I'm wondering what your what anything was surprising about the encyclical for you.
Well, I came into contact with this. I taught anthropology in the university in the Philippines in the mid-1970s, and I went down to a tribal group to help one of my students do their master's degree. I saw the impact of the destruction of the tropical rainforest on the rainforest itself, but also on the people. And at that time, we had very little in Catholic social teaching on this particular area. And quite frankly, if you had asked me 6 years ago, would I see this document in my hand in my lifetime, I would have said no. Don't forget, at the conference in Copenhagen 2009, climate change was not mentioned in Pope Benedict's encyclical Caritas in Veritate. That's only in 2009. So this is, to me, I would maintain that we as Catholics, against the World Council of Churches, who did wonderful work in the 1980s and 1990s, and we didn't always help them. We were supposed to be part of the World Council of Churches great meeting in 1990 in Korea, and the Catholic Church pulled out maybe 3 or 4 months beforehand. So this document, I think we've gone from almost kindergarten up to, if you want to use those terms, up to at least masters are heading into doctoral program, because it is so rich, it's so new, it's so well connected. There are very few documents from any organization, I would say, United Nations, that capture the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor in such a comprehensive and in such a challenging and such a real way. And that's why people are finding it important. But I would say for the church, we have to give a lot more time to talking about it, to seeing these major changes, the one in the area, for example, of morals, that the patriarch Bartholomew talks about, the ones particularly in the area of spirituality, everything is inviting an acclaim from me, and it should begin to change my whole understanding of what it is to be a Christian in the 21st century. I would give this document, if anyone said to me, could you give me one document that would help me get a real handle on what Christianity is meant for in the 21st century, this document, I'd start them off with.
Thank you very much. That's excellent. And Father Perry has rejoined us. Father, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the influence of St. Francis on this document. You're uniquely positioned to do that. When you look at Francis's approach to the environment, how has that played out in Laudato Si? What influence does Francis have in Laudato Si?
A very interesting question. I think I'm not sure who it was, which Franciscan was involved in the early draft. I'd like to find out who it was, have a conversation with them. I think they did an excellent job presenting Francis's vision as he understood it at the time, and Bonaventure and several others who tried to enter into the mystery of what St. Francis was talking about when he named and personalized things. He talked about brother sun, sister moon. He talked about the relationship. It's interesting, in the Canticle of the Creatures itself, the first introductory remark is a praise to God. And then after that, the following 9 strophes are how creation is responding to the invitation, its vocation. And it's only after those series of comments on how creation is responding that St. Francis admits that humanity is not responding as well. And that's the call for reconciliation, for pardon. And then the last element of the original Canticle is reconciliation with death itself. So admitting our limits, that we are not gods, that we do not have the power over all things, that we should be subjected to things. And I think this is another element that comes out in the document of Laudato Si, the book's encyclical, is this understanding of our place in creation, that we are a part, an integral part, that we are not the masters. We are co-creators with creation itself. We're called to a participatory vocation. And so that the way we respond by dignifying creation actually raises the dignity of our own response, our own vocation to Laudato Si, to the response to the cry of the planet and to the cry of the poor. And I think this is very important to keep these two together, the cry of the planet, the cry of the poor. There are tears being shed here. In a sense, I think, probably perhaps from a Franciscan perspective, not only in recent theological discussions, the God who cries for God's people. And I think there's a sense of this in the document, God crying for the planet, God crying for all creatures, and inviting us to this new relationship. So I think there's a central theme of the relational nature of all things, the co-responsibility that we are partners together. This is something which I, perhaps in reading a little bit into St. Francis, but I don't think so, because his whole notion of fraternitas, of the universal fraternity, extending progressively beyond the bounds of Assisi to all of Italy, beyond the bounds of Italy, even to Damiette's encounter with the Muslim leader, the warlord, if you will, and then later on his praise of all creation, his encounter with creation, and discovering in it God's presence, God. This is a true sign that God is there. I think this is, I really think the document captures this in a very creative way. I was intrigued, 2 Franciscans about 3 weeks ago said, well, it's a horrible document. They don't talk much about St. Francis. I said, well, you obviously, you must, let me give you, here's the Laudato Si, you must be reading something else.
Thanks very much. Now we can have time for questions from our viewing audience. And I thought I'd ask Professor Miller this question. For those of you who are joining us, we have Father Michael Perry, Minister General of the Franciscan Order, Father Sean McDonagh, a Columban Eco-theologian, and Professor Vincent Miller at the University of Dayton. Professor Mary Evelyn Tucker of Yale University had to leave early. So Professor Miller, here's a very interesting question. And I'll preface it a little bit. There's a lot in the document about the responsibility of industry, of corporations. Somewhat surprising to me when it came out. I was very happy to see that. And Anne asks, how can we convince captains of industry that we don't need to have annual profit increases, that it is okay to have profit, but it does not have to be bigger and bigger every year? What would you say to that, Professor Miller?
I'd say maybe the pathway in the encyclical is to focus on the connections between the economy and the world around us. So profits will not continue if we continue to unsustainably destroy the environment, right? So the thriving of the economy is connected to the natural world. And so taking care of the natural world is the best way to ensure long-term profits. Those two goals are united over the long term. So the real question is, how can we communicate these interconnections between economics and the environment? And to get to the heart of the question, though, is push beyond the quarter-to-quarter thinking or the year-to-year thinking. And many corporations are doing that. And we need to focus on the fact that in the long term, profits and environmental stewardship unite.
Thank you very much. Excellent answer. Father Sean, here's a question for you. From Eltring. I'm not sure if that's a name or a handle. Father Sean, since the encyclical sees our contribution to climate change as a sin, with many victims in the present and in the future, do you think Catholics will now be encouraged to bring to confession their sins toward the environment and the climate, and be sent into the world with more than 3 Hail Marys to recite? What do you think? Do you think that will affect people's sort of personal moral inventory as well?
We focused very much often on God and just on the neighbor. Now we're asked to move beyond that and to understand our lives. For example, working in industry, we understand we're not going to be destroying things. Yeah, but it'll still take a while for us to make the theological connection between what Pope Francis is saying. But I would love to see, for example, in that whole area of reconciliation, I'd love to see the general absolution reality, where we would go maybe a Sunday during the year, for example, the Sundays, for example, of September. We would take some Sunday, for example, like the oceans. What are we doing to the oceans? And what future is there in the oceans if we're actually treating them the way we have for the last 70 years? Understanding what we are doing, then looking for things we could do to work for a more sustainable oceans. And then, yes, the reality of looking for forgiveness for how we have lived without running on us any of the trips of guilt that Mary Ellen talked about in the past. That's not what this is about, but it is about encountering our world in that fullest way, with the data of the world, what's happening, with the wonder of our theological tradition, helping us to understand it and also helping us to celebrate it. So yes, I would love to see new celebrations. I'd love to see celebrations where we would celebrate that the curlew will no longer be with us, and on the awful sadness that will be for future generations. He has a lovely section, for example, on intergenerational justice. These are new concepts in our Catholic Church, that we have a responsibility for the generation, not just of humans, but the generation of every creature that actually follows us on this planet. And we should be expanding our sacramental world. He has lovely things on the sacramental world. For example, the cosmic nature of the Eucharist, that is no longer just within this human community or within this religious community. So yes, there's extraordinary areas here of new sacramental spirituality that links us with the great sacraments that we have in our tradition.
Thank you, Father Sean. Yes, and I heard echoes of Teilhard de Chardin as well in some of his comments on the cosmic nature of the sacraments and even of Christ. Father Perry, here's a very good question. How do you interpret the expression of St. John Paul, that human beings are to dominate the world, while Pope Francis stresses that human beings and all creatures, even the smallest ones, are the same? And, you could even go before St. John Paul, sort of we're meant to rule the world in a sense. Is there a tension in that, or do you think that there's been kind of a development in doctrine on that issue of, say, that domination?
I think that maybe it would be too early to say that there's been a development. I think that Pope Francis is being prophetic here. I think that still probably the dominant theological and even interactional model in most people's minds is that we are to dominate, we are to control the world. I think it's still present in some of the religious traditions, some of the preaching, and just the thinking, the way people use and even abuse things. I think the discardable society, if you will, we can throw things away. We don't have to worry about the electricity, making sure we limit the use of energy, etc. I think it's going to take a long time. That's why I think it's all of next year, 2017, the Franciscan Order is going to dedicate the entire year to Laudato Si. Everything we're going to try to do is focus on this, so that we can begin to allow this to penetrate, to enter into our thinking, into our ways of understanding and rethinking a little bit, who is God? Who are we in relationship to God and with each other? I think that this Laudato Si, I think the document, the encyclical, challenges us to reframe.
Yes? Hello?
I think we lost him. Maybe we'll get him back.
In number 67, for example, he says, the Genesis chapter 1 verse 28 does not encourage unbridled exploitation of nature by painting him as a domineering and destructive. He said this is not a correct interpretation of the Bible. So he is actually bringing into this area a new understanding of our relationship with the natural world.
Great, thank you, Father Sean. Father Perry, do you want to continue? You're back with us.
Sorry, I'm facing some challenges, technological challenges. This wonderful technology that has solved all the global problems that we are facing. I think I wanted to perhaps just conclude by saying I think that there's a call for a reimagination of our Christian lives, a reimagination of our discipleship, a reimagination of of humanity, the way humanity perceives itself. That's why I think one of the greatest strengths of the entire document, it's echoed in chapters 2, 3, and 4, implied, if you will, but it appears in chapter 1 and is repeated in chapter 5, this whole notion that we are engaged in a process of dialogue. And this dialogue is not something that we're just talking. It's a dialogue that seeks to produce transformation, conversion. So I think that this is something which I would add to. And I think Father Sean said at the last, I just caught several seconds of that there is a seismic shift here that's taking place. That is taking place. But like all seismic shifts, nothing happens all at one time. It's going to take a long time. And my hope is that this will not get lost in a campaign or another document or something else. I really hope that we can make this. We need to commit to this for the long haul. It's not like processes of reconciliation and peace. In order for those to take effect, it's a minimum of 10 years or longer. And I think this is the same thing with this document.
Thanks very much. Yes, it takes a while to digest these documents. Professor Miller, here's a very good question from Kay Lynch, and I think it's something that a lot of people are curious about, even people that have read the document cover to cover. What are the small things we can do from day to day to preach and live this life-changing encyclical? How might you answer that?
There's so many things we can do. I think one of the great revolutionary paths of moral transformation in this document focuses on relationship, on opening our eyes to the rest of creation that we share the world with. And I think that's something we model for others, right? Noticing what's happening in the world around us, what's happening with the insects in our area, what's happening with the plants, thinking about where our power comes from. So I'm speaking from Southwest Ohio, and my power comes from coal taken from mountaintop removal. Right? Just to know those connections, to make them part of our lives, part of our conversation. Not simply, always telling people try to do X, Y, or Z because the environment requires it, to make it a moral imperative, but to open our awareness to these connections, see what they are, make them part of our conversation, make them part of our appreciation, right? So mountaintop removal is a negative part of that, but to greet the return of the honeybees in the spring, or to eagerly await to see if the monarchs will come this summer, and talk to people about these things are happening. I think it's really that spirituality of connection is a non-polemical way to open up these conversations. To not make it immediately about economic, moral, or political decisions, but to really attend to things and love them.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes, and here's a question from Judith, and it was originally directed towards Dr. Tucker, but Father Sean, maybe you can answer it since you work so closely with her. And it's a good question. Science and religion, to many, don't seem to work together. I think, says Judith, that Laudato Si has beautifully corrected that perspective. Am I right to think this? So do you feel that Laudato Si have brought science and religion together?
Yes, but science and religion, shouldn't have been very far apart. I mean, the founder of genetics was a Catholic priest. The man who actually came up with the emerging universe, George the Mite, he was a Catholic priest. I think the church has tried over the years, but certainly in this document, he uses the best of science in terms of climate change, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the chemicalization of the planet, the first part of chapter 1. And I think the science has actually helped people to understand these realities, and I hope this will go forward. But I would also like that in this, what he does here is he brings also a public knowledge, a public presentation of our faith. That our faith has something to say about all of these things. And in many ways, it has an enriching thing to say about all of these things. So that science and religion do work wonderfully together. I was just looking there through the microscope yesterday at a green plant. We now know, because of microscopes, how chlorophyll works. The last 15, 20 years, we're actually beginning to see for photosynthesis. And I believe myself, that understanding of science brings us right into the heart of where God is in our world. And that's the kind of reality, working together, connectedness, that I think will bring about this extraordinary change that we begin to live sustainably and begin to enjoy this world. I'm looking out at an oak tree that supports an oak tree supports almost 250 other species. There is a connectedness right at the heart of just about every place people are at. Laudato Si celebrates that.
Thank you. Here's a question. I think I'll direct it to Father Perry. And Father Sean mentioned this before, saying that Laudato Si references, particularly in the footnotes, something like 21 bishops' conferences from around the world. So Father Perry, Stephanie Clary asks us, how does the fact that Pope Francis is the first pope from a non-Westernized background inform this encyclical? What influence do you see of his own background from Latin America on this encyclical?
Well, I think probably the clearest way to understand Pope Francis from at least from something that's written, is to go to Aparecida, the document of the Latin American, the Selam, the Latin American bishops. And there, anyone who's read the document knows that there's a social analysis, a very good social analysis that takes place in the context of looking at the theological and the pastoral responsibility of the church in the world today in the context of Latin America. So I think that one place that listeners, people could go to, is to read that document. And I think it would help them understand a little bit his approach, his understanding. Second, I think he's a person who, for one reason or another, and it's the mystery of grace in his own life, but he has simplified his life. He has found a cause to, something has pushed him to simplicity. And I don't know, much like with the experience of St. Francis of Assisi, was it the San Damiano cross speaking to him, or was it the leper who pushed him into the cross, the leper he met on the road? I don't know, maybe a similar parallel I would make in the life of Jorge Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, that perhaps it was the close contact he had with the poor that helped him open up to a much greater reality. Or were there other elements? And again, he has a somewhat scientific background, so he comes to this whole discourse with tremendous knowledge. But I think that this link with the poor is something direct to say with what he has discovered, the link with creation. And I think perhaps for us that could be one starting point for us to the simplicity of life and linking our lives much more closely with the reality, the situation of our sisters and brothers who are suffering throughout the world, whether they're in whatever form of poverty that they find themselves, absolute or relative, and in whatever state of affairs, conflicts or movements throughout the world, running from one state of a situation to another, war or lack of resources to a place where they hope to find some solace, some future. So that would kind of be my response. Maybe it's a bit simplistic.
Thank you very much. We're reaching the end of our time. I want to thank all of the participants. I want to follow up on something that Father Perry just said. I think also the idea of discernment, as Father Sean was saying, is very important. It's a very, among other things, Jesuit concept, but this idea of looking at the signs of the times and discerning where the Spirit is leading us. And obviously that's something that, that influenced Pope Francis's, very desire to put this document out. So I'd like to thank Father Michael Perry, Minister General of the Franciscan Order, who is speaking to us from Medellin. Thank you very much, Father Perry. Dr. Mary Evelyn Tucker had to leave early, but I want to thank her publicly from Yale University. She was very helpful. Father Sean McDonagh, a Columban eco-theologian, thank you so much for your participation and all of your work over the years on this issue. And thank you finally to Professor Vincent Miller for your participation from the University of Dayton. Thank you, Vince.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I want to thank all of our participants. I want to thank the Global Catholic Climate Movement for setting this up, this webinar, and for all of you who have been participating, you know, in groups or individually in front of your computer. One final encouragement, I think, is if you haven't read the document, read the document and let it move your heart. This is Father Jim Martin from America Magazine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Read the document.
3 times.
At least.